because the larger the government, the smaller the citizen. That's typically the right-wing approach. I actually had a debate on Sunday night with a Hebrew roots guy, flat Earth or whatever. And I noticed that one tactic they use when they discuss theological ideas with me is demagoguery. They act like they're all shocked that my theology doesn't align with that of most Jews. They're, oh, well, you don't believe this, when they already know I don't believe it. Because I always start off in saying, let's try to justify what we both believe within the five books of Moses. And they'll say, only within the five books of Moses? Absolutely. And then I'll explain how Judaism has a hierarchy. It's not how Christians or Karaites look at it, that, the book of Amos is as holy as the book of Exodus. There's clearly a hierarchy that's never mentioned, right? And I usually tell Christians, let's start at the five books. If you can't prove your belief system within the five books, why even continue on, right? That's typically my tactic. And they're typically expecting to listen to someone who just sounds like every other Orthodox individual. These Messianics and Hebrew roots guys, they train for this. There's so many counter-missionary response books out there. Like, basically, were designed to respond to a Tovia Singer type counter-missionary, because that's pretty much what they all are. They're all students of Tovia Singer. Tovia Singer's a nice guy. They've been using his tactics and his interpretations to Christian texts for at least over 25 years. So I am not of the opinion that one has to believe in the resurrection of the dead. I consider it an optional belief. I mean, the New Testament embraces the notion, not just that notion, but many other mystical notions of the first century, which were rabbinic. And the notion of the resurrection of the dead was one of them. I personally don't believe in the resurrection of the dead, but the way I present it to other people is that I don't feel that God is going to hold it against you for not believing in a concept, a metaphysical concept that's not mentioned in Torah.
Is the only thing that I was just kind of going through Torah. I was just looking for this the other day. The only thing I can find was that where he says to Abraham, "You'll be with your family again." Is that what we use to justify the resurrection of the dead in Torah? Because I can't find anything else that really talks about an afterlife. Or
there's nothing in Torah. There's nothing literal about it. We could find foreshadowings of anything, but it's hard to say that the resurrection of the dead is a belief that stems from the five books of Moses, right? I mean, heck, Messianics say that Jesus is in the five books of Moses and every other page of the Bible, right? But it's not literally there. When you're trying to establish where something comes from, you have to deal with context and the literal meaning of phrases. The notion of the resurrection of the dead doesn't stem from the five books of Moses. What it does stem from, not that it's completely contextually, literally there, is Ezekiel chapter 37, the valley of the dry bones, and Daniel chapter 12. So that aside, first you have to establish that this notion, this metaphysical notion, was developed much, much later. Whether it was developed because it was written in the book of Ezekiel, whatever, but it's not in the five books of Moses. Now, to get back to Ezekiel, now Ezekiel and Daniel were contemporaries of themselves. They lived in the same time. Jeremiah as well. But anyways, Ezekiel 37 describes the valley of dry bones. Now, we have to first ask, who was Ezekiel? When did he live? And who was he prophesying to? So Ezekiel lived during the second exile. The first exile was the northern kingdom's exile to Assyria. They never repented and they never returned. Well, the second exile is Judah's exile to Babylon. Not all the Israelites were exiled to Babylon, just the smartest, the brightest, the richest, fine. Daniel is one of them, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. The job of the prophet, God raises up prophets, it says in Deuteronomy chapter 18, when Israel begins to emulate the nations they've displaced. It says, then I will raise up for you a prophet, right? And his words, which are ultimately my words, God's words, you must heed. So God raises up Ezekiel to prophesy to Israel while they're in exile so they can return back to the land of Israel. Now, the language of the prophets is a language full of symbolism, hyperbole, poetry, right? So we know, according to statements in the Psalms and in other places, that someone who's in exile without God, without Torah, is equivalent to a dead person, to a heap of bones. An Israelite not keeping Torah, it's like he's dead. And we see this from Torah. It says, keep this so that you shall live, right? That means if you're not keeping this, it's like you're a dead man. So God tells Ezekiel, prophesy on these bones. Not that they were actual literal bones there that he's bringing back to life, but he's painting a picture. The job of Ezekiel was to prophesy to downtrodden Israel and exile. He prophesies, obviously, the words of God, right? Because the prophet can't even add any of his own words. He has to reiterate what God already told him, because like he can't even add new commandments. As he starts prophesying the words of God to these bones, the bones hear the message, like I guess bones could hear messages, and they start coming back to life. Now, clearly, this is a sign of them absorbing the message and repenting, and then ultimately being brought out of the exile. It's not a coincidence that Ezekiel lived during the Babylonian exile. What's the job of a prophet in an exile? To get them out of that exile, not to prophesy something that's going to occur 3,000 years on the road, right? Because the resurrection of the dead hasn't occurred yet, right? So that's clearly what it's talking about. Then, of course, this is why it was detrimental that the Jewish people wrote down the words of the prophets. There's nowhere in the Torah that endorses Israel to write down the words of the prophets. The job of the prophet was to prophesy to the people in their generation, in their time of turmoil, to either prevent an exile or encourage redemption, but not for their words to be written down so that every generation could think that the end of the world is in their generation and right around the corner, which is what happened after the court of Hezekiah wrote down all these books. The books of the prophets were compiled by the court of Hezekiah. The Torah never sanctioned these books, but fine. The court, the rabbis, the judges decided that these books were good to give us a historical reference of the time and life of these prophets and how God acted and reacted in their lifetime. Okay. However, when these prophecies got detached to the actual exile they occurred in, they lost their meaning. In other words, every generation started reapplying with the words that the prophets were speaking to Israel at that time. In their time, people started applying it to their time. And even today, people continue. I mean, look at the Christians. Look at like Jack Van Imp and all these guys constantly reapplying prophecy. Oh, the doctrine of double prophecy, right? I mean, this is a Christian doctrine, right? They continue applying these things when these books weren't supposed to be written. Why? Because it's no coincidence that when these books entered the Jewish scene here, which is mainly when the Maccabees, or during the time of the Maccabees, where the Syrian Greeks outlawed the study of Torah, it was post the Maccabees that all the offshoots began. Gnosticism, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, it all started because they were all building doctrine off the books of the prophets, because they weren't allowed to study Torah because the Syrian Greeks outlawed the study of Torah. So they engulfed themselves in prophetical texts that had nothing to do with their time. They were historical books. And then out of these historical books, they developed notions like the Messiah. Now, I do believe in a Messiah, but as the Torah describes it, the Rambam says that the command to believe in the Messiah is Deuteronomy chapter 17, that God tells you that when you're ready, you could establish a king if you want. He says that's the commandment from the Torah, to believe in a Messiah. Well, that's very different to the Messiah what that people are expecting today, right? But the notion of the Superman Messiah came from this era and people viewing the books of the prophets in that manner. Initially, there was just the 5 books of Moses and the rulings from the court. That's it. That's all that existed. And now it's a shame that the average Jew or Christian walks around making no distinction between what appears in the book of Amos, in the book of Isaiah, in the book of Ezekiel, and what appears in the Torah. And worst of all, they combined them all together, which is ultimately a Catholic invention. It was the Catholics who invented Tanakh. In other words, traditionally, a Jew would never combine the Torah with any other book. They would have them separately. Even the prophets, they would have them as different scrolls. But now they have one book called the Holy Bible, right? Whether it's a Jewish or Christian Bible, and everyone walks around thinking that whatever is contained in these books carry the same weight. So of course a Christian's going to walk around saying, oh, well, Isaiah says this, but no matter if the Torah doesn't say it. You don't believe in Isaiah? It's all Torah. That's where the confusion arose. Yeah.
But wouldn't you say, though, technically speaking, if the Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, if he was true to Torah, that he, like you were saying, that he would only speak the words of Torah, then wouldn't it be reasonable to say that that what you find in Isaiah is Torah? Do you get
No.
what I'm trying to say? I don't know if
Torah,
the question came out right.
sure. Well, the word Torah just means instructions. There's nothing instructional, newly instructional within the prophets outside of come back to Torah. But Torah told you that in Torah, so it's not new.
Yeah.
So it's not instructional. Even in Jewish law, we don't say that we keep a halacha because Isaiah what kept it. Now the court looked inside the books of the prophets, and when they were creating rabbinic laws, some of those rabbinic laws were inspired because of things the prophet said, and the court ruled it into a rabbinic law. But it's not considered a Torah law coming from the prophet.
What would be an example of a rabbinical law coming from the prophet?
Oneg Shabbos. In
Shabbos,
Isaiah
okay.
55, it says that you shall rejoice in the Sabbath. Nowhere in the Torah does it say rejoice in the Sabbath. But the rabbis instituted as a rabbinic law that we have a rabbinic, not a Torah obligation, to be happy on the Sabbath. And they quote as inspiration Isaiah chapter 55. Fine.
Wow,
That's
okay.
not saying that Isaiah instituted it. It's just saying that it's a nice story. It's a nice statement that the judges who had authority to establish laws, not laws coming from God, but laws that are binding on Israel from a non-Torah level, as in terms of importance. Torah laws are more important than rabbinic laws, but the court had the authority to develop these laws. Fine. Now, Daniel chapter 12, being that Daniel lived in the same time as Ezekiel, he was reiterating the same idea. He said that there are those who are asleep in the dust. Clearly, Daniel speaking in Babylon, he says that there are those who are asleep in the dust who will arise to either everlasting glory or everlasting contempt. Fine. It's saying that people are either going to wake up to redemption because they repent and they accept Torah, or they're going to be completely cut off. They're going to wake up and realize that they're not in any covenant anymore. Again, we have to ask, who was Daniel? Where did he live? And to who was he speaking to? Daniel lived during the Babylonian exile. He was speaking to his situation in Babylon. He never, these individuals never thought that people for the, next 2,000 years would be quoting their words, trying to, tie it into presidential elections of the United States and constantly using their words as an almanac, foretelling things to come. It's ridiculous. Okay. So that's why the nicest way I could say it is that God does not require you. He's not going to hold it against you if you happen not to be convinced of this new doctrine of some resurrection of the dead. That's it. Now, it's interesting that, or at least I'm convinced, that Maimonides also didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. And that's actually what they said about him, because the resurrection of the dead doesn't appear in Mishnah Torah. The Mishnah Torah, the notion of the resurrection of the dead, doesn't believe, and that's the main book people use to explain the laws of Mashiach, what would happen when the Messiah comes, and he doesn't mention it. So the rabbis, like mainly the Chachamim of Aleppo, challenged him and insulted him, basically prohibited people from buying his book because they said that Maimonides denies the resurrection of the dead because he fails to mention it in his great work, the Mishnah Torah. So then he has to write a whole treatise, Egeret Techiyat HaMeitim. The letter, I guess you could view it as a response of how he believes in the resurrection of the dead. So then the Rambam basically says, fine, sure, I believe in it. So he says, how will it take place? People will come back to life and will die again. Because there's no monolithic understanding on how the resurrection of the dead is to take place. The Ramban has one view. Kabbalists have a completely different view. Here, for example, the Ramban, what Nachmanides says, that people come back to life because unlike the resurrection of the dead that appears in the New Testament, which is completely different than the one held by the Rishonim, the resurrection of the dead for a Christian is not a carnal resurrection. But they believe that you get resurrected with some sort of heavenly body, some say a body, some sort of body of light, something like that. According to traditional Judaism, our resurrection of the dead is completely carnal. It means that you will have the same body that you had before. Now, there's a debate. At what age, if you were sick, are you going to have, some sort of sick body? Like if you're missing an arm, will that arm be replaced? Fine. Of course, what later notions make it even harder to explain. Like when you throw in the even much later notion of reincarnation. If you're just a reincarnation of like 20 or 100 other Israelites in your past, then who's actually resurrecting? Right? In the end days, are they all resurrecting? Like when you're like really just an image of every one of those people who lived in all those different generations. So it seems that the web gets more and more tangled as people keep on adding more ideas. So the Rambam was of the idea that people resurrect just to die again. I mean, almost spitting in the face of his detractors. Then the resurrection of the dead doesn't mean anything if you're just resurrect again, because the notion of the resurrection of the dead in Judaism is that you resurrect on earth and you live on earth. According to the vast majority of Rishonim, you will live on earth forever. In other words, the Ramban, Nachmanides, means that you resurrect and you live basically with a human body forever.
I thought they were two separate instances. At first, I thought they were the same instance where we like live forever. It's all paradise, and then there's like when the Messiah comes, it's still death and taxes. But the dead rise and then die, and live lives again. I don't get that. See, the Messiah coming with the resurrection of the dead never made sense to me. Is that because because I don't pay much attention to it in Judaism, to be honest?
It's not a monolithic idea. It doesn't make sense to anyone. Everyone typically follows what their rabbi teaches, and their rabbi will hold to one opinion, but all these opinions ultimately contradict themselves. Yeah. So the big question that the rabbis ask is, when does it take place? Does it take place before Mashiach? Does it take place after Mashiach? No one really knows, because it's not a concept rooted in anything ancient. So this is why it's already stupid to walk around as someone who constantly, and I'm sure you guys are in the same boat, are here like trying to package your beliefs in such a way that you could explain it to somebody else. There's no way. I mean, if you're speaking to someone who's really inquisitive and smart and is asking you, okay, I'm sold on the Torah. Why do you believe in these other extra metaphysical ideas that don't appear in the Torah, right? I mean, only because a rabbi says something, some guy with a beard, well, that means it's true, right? Now, I'm not of the opinion that it's wrong to believe in some sort of resurrection of the dead. I just feel that God doesn't require you to believe in it. Now, the rabbis in the Talmud clearly did believe in a resurrection of the dead and made a statement that if you don't believe in a resurrection of the dead, you won't partake in the resurrection of the dead, and ultimately you won't have some sort of share in the world to come. That's ultimately just one opinion that the Rambam made famous. Right? Because the Rambam's 13 principles of faith include the resurrection of the dead. Now, the Rambam's 13 principles are really not laid out how we have them today. That was compiled later on by mystics who included it into our daily prayers as we have it today. I mean, daily, like we say, what's called Yigdal. So Yigdal is pretty much the 13 principles of faith. And towards the end of the prayers, they say the Ani Maamin. But it's people who took the Rambam, everything he wrote in his Parsha Mishnayot. In other words, the Rambam wrote a commentary to the Mishnah, right? And in the Mishnah, there's something called Perek Chelek. Perek Chelek appears in the Talmud as Sanhedrin 98. So this is the area where it talks about the Messiah and the world to come. It's that famous statement that all of Israel has a share in the world to come. It's funny that when people quote that, they don't quote it completely, because right after that, I mean, like pretty much in the same sentence, it says, and these are the ones that don't. And from these don'ts, we developed the Rambam's 13 principles of faith, which is really not the Rambam's, but he's basically just commenting on what this portion of the Mishnah is saying. So in this portion, it says that if you don't believe in the resurrection of the dead, you won't have a share in the world to come. Fine. It's not that the Rambam's saying this. He's commenting on basically every medrash that appears in the Mishnah, because he's writing a commentary to the Mishnah. But he doesn't really lay it down with all the words that we have in the 13 principles of faith nowadays, right? It's just later on abridged to these single 13 principles. So his commentary to the Mishnah is really one of his first works. It was actually written in Arabic. I mean, back then, most people wrote all the rabbinic literature in Arabic, or in their mother tongue, which was Arabic. I mean, Rav Sadigo and also wrote all in Arabic.
Where they lived, it's,
Yeah. No, I mean, it wasn't like it is nowadays. People think that it's almost beneath Jews to say anything in the common tongue, right? Even back then in the synagogues, they would pray in their common tongue, right? Which is really the preferable way to pray. And the Rambam says this, that it's preferable to pray in a language that you understand. Obviously, like, why would you pray to God in a language you don't understand? right? I mean, you have to be a modern day Orthodox Jew to do that. Right? I mean, the vast majority of people who go to a synagogue don't know what they're saying. I mean, they may be able to read Hebrew fast, but they don't know what they're actually reciting, which is kind of sad. People back then understood that this was just the Rambam's interpretation or explaining the statements that appear in the Mishnah. Not that he necessarily believed himself in a resurrection of the dead. He's just commenting on it because clearly the rabbis in the Talmud did believe in it. However, that when it was time for him to codify law in terms of what we must do, and even towards the end of days, because like Hilchos Malachim deals with the laws of Mashiach. Now, like Mashiach has nothing for us to do, all right? I mean, it's really a mystical book, right? Or anything dealing with the Messiah is mystical. That would have been the time that he would have mentioned the notion of the resurrection of the dead. And because he failed to mention it, meant that he didn't really believe in it. However, there's another book called Sefer HaMitzvot, the Book of Commandments. Now, Sefer HaMitzvot was also written in Arabic. However, it was written as part of the Mishneh Torah. Sefer HaMitzvot is part of the Mishneh Torah, but what the printers did, they split it up into two books, ultimately to make more money. And even if you see a Mishneh Torah today, like just go to the Chabad. If you go to the Chabad website, it has all of the 613 commandments right in the beginning, but it leaves out the commentary to every one of those 613 commandments. And they split it up into another book called Sefer Mitzvot. Now, the reason it's important to have the 613 commandments in his Code of Jewish Law is that he starts every book in Mishneh Torah enumerating all the Torah commands, which he mentioned earlier in Sefer Mitzvot, in the Book of Commandments, and then all the rabbinic commands, saying that basically making a link between the written law and the oral law. However, in his Book of Commandments, there's no commandment to believe in the resurrection of the dead. In other words, he mentions Mashiach, like Deuteronomy chapter 17, the law to establish a king. He mentions the law to believe in the oral law, also Deuteronomy chapter 17, the law to heed the words of the judges, to not stray from the right or left from what they instruct you. I mean, he speaks about, and forget about the reincarnation, because that didn't really become popular until much, much later. I mean, the Rambam never mentions reincarnation. So that's why we really have to break away from this notion. Also, like the notion that there's some sort of perpetual messianic kingdom to come, or there's a time that's going to come, as the book of Revelation talks about, some sort of heavenly Jerusalem that's going to come down, and we're all going to live together, like, and we're not going to have the ability to sin because God's going to take away like the Yetzer Hara and all this stuff. Like the Torah doesn't say that either. The Torah never says that the world's coming to an end. It never says that there's going to be an age where Israel doesn't sin anymore. It basically lays down a formula for sin, prophetic intervention, exile, and redemption. Right? If we sin and we stop keeping God's commandments, God, in his mercy, he sends out his prophets to try to get us on the right track. If we fail to listen to these prophets, he exiles us. And only if we repent, he redeems us. He brings us back. And it seems like that's going to happen over and over again. This notion that a time is coming where some Messiah is going to come and just going to like fight all our battles, and then we're just going to like worship God or just study Torah for the rest of our lives, but we're not going to be able to sin or be thrown into exile again, doesn't appear anywhere in the Torah. A messianic age really doesn't exist either. A messianic age is any age that Israel has been redeemed, exists in a redeemed status with a temple and a high priest, ideally Israel. That's the messianic age. In other words, there is no messianic age, there are messianic ages. That's why some sort of eternal messianic age where, you know, like a lamb will lie down with a wolf and the cobra's nest and the whole stuff like that. Even the Rambam says that's just a metaphor for that when Israel gets their act together, that with the lamb is Israel, and like the wolves are the nations of the world, and the wolves won't be attacking Israel. I mean, the Rambam also explains that in the Messianic age, nothing's going to change. This is one opinion in the Talmud. It says Rav Shmuel holds like this, that there is no difference between this world and the Messianic age, with the exception that in the Messianic age, the Jews will be allowed to study Torah in peace. That's it. But there's something miraculous that's going to happen. Now, I believe this for a while, but I just haven't said it too much because there's going to be a lot of people who are going to throw me under the bus just because, they're yes men. They just want to fit in with other people. Oh, of course, I believe in the resurrection of the dead, and I believe in the reincarnation. I believe in every metaphysical concept that doesn't appear in the 5 books of Moses. Everything metaphysical has to stem from Torah, because those are the only words of God that we have, that God ordered us to write down. He ordered every Israelite to write a Torah scroll in his lifetime. He ordered every king to write 2 of them. And he ordered Moshe Rabbeinu to write 13 Sifrei Torah. All right. But in terms of later books, and this guy I was discussing, he's a nice guy, but this guy was bringing down the book of Enoch, the book of Jubilees, the book of Baruch. And it's true. If you're going to include other books as books that have a progression in your revelation, then where do you cap it off? So why do you just include the Quran and the Book of Mormon? And who's to say that God is going to stop talking to you? Now, the Torah clearly says, don't add or take away from anything that's in here, right? And it tells us also in Deuteronomy 29, verse 29, that the secret things are for God and only the revealed things are for us, i.e., that we shouldn't waste our time, trying to dissect God. In other words, the Torah itself has a safety net to keep us from hopping into cults. And that's it telling you twice, don't add anything to this. Because we continue adding to it, the religion we follow nowadays doesn't resemble the religion they followed.
I have an interesting question.